Okay, welcome. It's almost Shabbos, but we still got a little time since this is one of the latest days of the year. Shabbos is coming in pretty late, so we can catch up on the Key to Redemption, episode 7, number 2, class number 2. So we were learning, and I was hoping I would give a class yesterday, but I was busy with other classes and I didn't get to it. So this is class number 2. We'll have to complete it, Bezrat Hashem, early next week. Although I think I'm going to get through most of it. All right, so we left off over here. We were talking about the objective of lighting up the world, the lamps that the Torah is giving us the mitzvah of lighting the lamps. And one of the instructions regarding lighting the lamps is that the lamp has to go up on its own. And we learned that the lesson of this is that even though in our lives holiness, godliness, higher consciousness, higher godly awareness, and divine illumination is something that has to be channeled and drawn down to us from above, beginning with God drawing it down to each and every one of us, downloading it to us, then the assistances of holy people, spiritual people, rabbis, teachers, mentors, guides, parents that try to deliver and educate. But there has to be a certain point where holiness and godliness becomes who we are. In other words, the Torah starts to flow from within us. We don't need to receive it from above. That's the idea. Like a flame, a candle, you light a candle, and initially the fire is being transmitted to the wick from outside. But once the candle is able to grab that fire, the wick on its own with the oil and the whole lamp, and the lamp is now fueling it from within itself. In other words, the lamp owns the fire. And the source of the fire is coming from within the lamp, not from outside. And that's the objective. God wants holiness, that our connection to Him should not be coming from an outside source. Like in Torah, initially we're supposed to study Torah from all our mentors and teachers. But eventually we should have our mind should become like a spring of Torah, obviously based on the can't just go and make up whatever we want. But once we're anchored and we know the Torah well, then our own mind becomes like a spring that keeps on producing new water and so on and so forth. Same is also with mitzvahs. We discussed this in the last point of the class that we learned the class episode 7, class 1, was the idea that a mitzvah, even though a physical human body, is interested in its own material physical pleasures. That's what the body wants to do. It wants to be comfortable, it wants to be happy, it wants to be satisfied, it wants to be well fed, it wants to be well rested, it always wants to be comfortable, it wants to have its pleasures, and so on and so forth. And serving God is not always on its primary agenda of the body. And the soul a lot of times has to wrestle with the body, fight the body, override the body's interests. And living a life as a Jew means to continuously override the body. Body wants, we tell it no. Body wants, we tell it no. Body wants, we tell it no. Because that's how we infuse spirituality and holiness. We overcome the impulses, desires, cravings, and lusts of the body. That's the way it is. So it's a struggle. It's a struggle between spirit and matter. But that's not the divine intention. The divine intention is initially it should be a battle, but eventually the soul should dominate to the point where the body becomes so broken into that the body from within itself is already compliant with holiness, with godliness, to the point that it becomes natural to the body to do a mitzvah. And it becomes natural to the body to run the entire day in accordance to God's will, to make all matters of holiness and spirituality primary, fixed in its schedule. Not that you have to drag the body. Now, the body is sometimes, you go horseback riding. There's 2 types of horses. There's a horse that has not been broken into. So that horse is used to it. Every 2 minutes he's going off the path because he's always running around this way and that way looking for hay to munch on, to grass, right? You ever been on such a horse? And you have to fight with it, pull him back, pull him back, pull him back. Then there is an obedient horse. The horse has already learned that if he's in the stall and going on a horseback ride with a pack of horses, and even if it's a 2-hour ride, 3 hour, now his business is not running around rummaging for food. Now its business is to follow the path and to go like a nice boy or a nice girl up to where it needs to and come back down, and then eventually you let him back into the what do they call it, the pen or whatever they call the horse carroll, and the horse will have its will have its hay, but the horse has been broken into. So that's what God wants. Eventually, our bodies should become so broken into till it becomes second nature. Like we discussed, the idea that the rabbis and the sages say that we have to thank our body, that automatically, instinctively, it knows where to bow down during Shemona Esrei. It's exactly without, even if you're mindless and your mind is not there, the knees know exactly when to bow, and the hands know when to bang over here, which is a banging of forgiveness and the like. Now the Rebbe adds, this is what we learned till last week. Now the Rebbe adds, and he says, well, even in this great depth he adds over here, even in this notion, once you get your body to become so, you make your body into a mitzvah body, where the body is comfortable with mitzvahs, and it is naturally, it starts becoming natural and smooth, the observance of mitzvahs. Even that can be on two ways. On a more external level, what you're doing is you're implementing onto the body a second nature. In other words, you're running a program on the body, and eventually the body is now compliant with this program till it stops resisting. That's what it is. It starts to kind of accept the fact that this is life, and this is what it's here for. This is what it needs to do. So. And that's called second nature. And we would think, based on what we just learned, that that's the ultimate, because now your body, the physicality itself, became godly oriented. It's now a servant of God. The Rebbe says that's good, but that's not the ultimate. Why is that not the ultimate? Because still, it's still foreign to the body what you're making the body do. Essentially, the pleasure and the identity of the body is the physical, material enjoyments of life. The body is as far as can be from anything godly and holy, right? Spiritual. The body is not into that. The body is a body. It's just that the body almost has no choice. You've kind of blocked all other. It's like you trained it in. It's like training an animal. You train the ego. You train the animalistic soul until it becomes. But the Rebbe says, no. Eventually, what happens is you have to uncover the true essence of the body. What is the body in essence? Body's material. All material comes from what? Comes from God. Who says only the spiritual comes from God and the physical comes from God? The difference between spirituality and physical is that the spiritual, like angels, souls, and the like, are aware of God, and therefore they are surrendered to God and they want to serve Him. The physical is uptight in itself, knows only of itself, doesn't know of anything holy and godly, and as a result of that, is naturally inclined to disobey God and do its own thing, right? That's what we say. But that is not understanding the depth of what the body is. The material physical world, in a sense, being that it too is a creation of God, God is actually communicating and expressing through the physical something about Himself that He's not expressing in the spiritual. The spiritual is expressing God by being surrendered to God, by putting God first. That's the nature of the spiritual. The nature of the physical is to be rigid and stuck up in itself. That's what physicality does. It doesn't, because it's thick and dense, it doesn't know other than the self. So then in that sense, it's the biggest heretic. It's the greatest apostate. It ignores God. But Chassidus, this is what the Chassidic masters say, the body is really holding the deepest secret. The reason why the body is so into itself is because the body is really expressing God's truest self. God's very self is absolute, because God's very self doesn't come from something. See, the reason why things are surrendered to something else is because they realize they're dependent on something. They come from something else. So if you're my source, I have to be obedient to you. If you're responsible for my existence, I need to surrender to you. I need to serve your interests. And therefore, in the spiritual world, there's no such a thing as an absolute being, because not everything, if you feel absolute, what do you mean? You're absolute. You're into yourself. Who are you? Your every breath is being given to you from above. That's the way spirituality feels. It's tuned into truth, and that's the truth. Now, the truth of the physicality is also that way, that God is continuously feeding it its existence, and therefore the physical, by not acknowledging that, is the most removed from holiness and godliness. However, that's not the real story. That's not the ultimate story. The ultimate story is that what God is transmitting to the physical is what God himself feels. God's existence is absolute because he doesn't stem from something before him. So he's absolute. And that absoluteness God is expressing through physical material. So the rigidity of the physical is really the strength and the substance and the ultimate reality of God's very self. And once we're done with the purification of the physical through Torah and mitzvahs, through learning Torah and doing mitzvot with the physical, we will then experience a physical world that speaks the loudest of God and communicates God to us more than any other spiritual world, more than the heavens and the most enlightened heavens above. The physical will be able to give us the truth of God that nothing else can give. We will see that the substance of the physical is really the substance of the essence of God. Wild stuff. And that's the true story of the body. So it's almost like the body has never really revealed her secret. And that's the whole point of the resurrection. Why are we coming back into physical bodies? Because as long as we are floating in the spiritual worlds, in the worlds of light, we will only know God's lights. We will never know God's essence. So souls need to be reincarnated in a body, and it will be a new body. Why will it be a new body? It's the same body, but the body kind of goes through first the death, and it decomposes, but it doesn't decompose completely. The essential DNA is left over. And from there, God reconstructs the body. But this time, the body is now living its truth. It will be a body, it will be physical with its sense of beingness, with the powerful sense of beingness, but its beingness won't be its beingness. Its beingness will be conveying the beingness of God. That's the truth of the body. So the Rebbe says like this, so that's going to be in the time of the resurrection. That's going to be the ultimate experience of physicality. But even before we get there, even before we get to that point, today's days, we can unplug this truth in the body. And in that, once we unplug that, once we kind of open that up in our own bodies, we realize the body is not an enemy. The body is not something we ought to fight. We will discover the deepest truth of our own bodies, that our body is connected to God even more than our soul. And then, of course, our body is in sync and in line with mitzvahs. At this point, it stops resisting. The question is, what is it using its absoluteness? Is it using its absoluteness in a way to deny the mitzvah, which means it's stubborn in the fact that it wants to eat something that God says it's not kosher, or it wants to derive pleasure from a physical relationship that God does not approve of? Right, some kind of a forbidden relationship, or does the body take a stand for holiness in a way that is unbudgeable, like with the stubbornness that only a body can have, in which the body stands for a mitzvah, and it does the mitzvah with such absoluteness, with such certainty, and that no one is going to bully me around, no one's going to push. I'm no pushover. I'm going to stand there with absoluteness doing God's will. So then suddenly the very difficulty of the body becomes its asset. The very darkness of the body becomes its ultimate plus, its ultimate connection. That's the depth. That's the depth of our bodies. And eventually when we say that we don't need inspiration from the outside. You shouldn't need your soul continuously, right? Affecting your body. Your body should be a mitzvah body on its own. This is the intention. This is where we want to get to it. We don't need it. We don't need to impress it upon the body from the outside. We just need to reveal it for what it truly is. And once we live with our Mashiach bodies, it will be so natural to us to live exactly according to God's will in doing it, because the true beingness of our physical material body is the reason we have a physical hand is to do a mitzvah, to do tzedakah. The reason, the very identity of our brain is and our intelligence is knowing Torah, and so on and so forth. And that is our body, not just our soul. So that's the meaning. Now your menorah is burning from within itself. Now, all of this is regarding, so this was chapter 6. Now we go on to chapter 7. Now the Rebbe says the same applies. We take this further, not only regarding our own observance within ourselves, but also as we start to draw down holiness in the world around us. Again, as a result of our mitzvah observance, we don't just affect our own selves, we affect the world around us, the materials of the world. And all the 613 commandments with all the mitzvahs that we do bring about a purification, a rectification, and a sublimation, and an elevation of all material, of all matter. When we are done with our mitzvah observance, only God knows how long. The Rebbe says we're kind of past the finish line already. After we've done our work across the entire world, implementing mitzvahs into the materials of the world. For instance, when we're doing tzedakah, when we're giving charity, it's not just our body that is engaged in it. There is a dollar bill, there is a piece of metal, there's a quarter, there's a nickel, there is a dime, there is a penny. There is a tzedakah box. That's a charity box. There is a pen. There is paper. A checkbook. There is an app. There is PayPal, which is being sublimated. All right. There's money transfers. There is Venmo. There is Zelle. There's people give charity on all these different ways. So all these powers, all these computers, all these transactions, financial transactions that are all in the sense of charity, we are remaking physicality of the world to become that the world stops obscuring the divine, it starts revealing God. So even though we don't see it today, I don't see that the pen that I use to write a check for my favorite charity, I don't see that this pen is no more matter that conceals God. It is matter that reveals God. I don't see it yet. But when Mashiach will come and God will turn on the lights, matter will look completely different to us. The entire physical matter of the world will look completely different to us. We'll see within matter, it's the truth of all material, that it's all God, creating it, making it, sustaining it. Now, by the way, we've already reached a certain purification because at least today's day, scientifically, we can observe that matter is energy. For thousands of years, people thought matter is just matter. It's just an object. It's just a thing. And now we know it's energy. Now we just need to go a little deeper and recognize that energy is all really one unified energy, one force that's creating everything. And that's the force of God that's in everything. Well, a little bit more purification, and there we are. That's what we will see. Our naked eye will behold that. And that means that we walk around the world and we're bringing holiness into the world. Now, that job of bringing holiness into the world goes through stages. Initially, the world is created in a way, the material matter of the world, similar to our bodies that we spoke about earlier. Initially, the materials of the world are created to obscure and hide holiness and godliness. So we do not see source within the physical. That's the way it is. So, and it is so thick and dense and uncooperative or uninhospitable to godliness and to holiness that it took a miracle to allow for it to happen. meaning it took a superpower. It says that when God created the world, the manner in which he created it is that the physical cannot have any relationship towards holiness. God created it in that way that it is utterly and completely cut off from an awareness of a source. It's completely cut off. And then by Sinai, the Midrash tells us, God went against that very essential rule that he created. He broke that barrier, and he gave us the mitzvahs, in which, through the observance of mitzvahs, we bind heaven and earth. We bind matter and spirit. We bind up the physical with God, with the divine. Okay, and we're given mitzvahs. Now, again, as we said before, we don't see the difference with our naked eyes, but as soon as we do a mitzvah, we infuse a physical object with godly light and holiness. And then eventually, till we finish this project of reaching every part of the world. That's why we discussed many times, the Jewish people who were given the job of this sublimation did not stay in one place, but they have been wanderers. They have been moved around. We've been mobile. We've been moving around from place to place, from country to country, across the diaspora, across the entire world, far from our homeland, the land of Israel, because we need to transform all matter across the entire world. How do we do that? By living in a country, eating, breathing the oxygen of the country, utilizing the resources of the country, and doing mitzvahs with these resources. We actually transform, fix, elevate, purify the material physical world and make it God. But that's only stage number one. Because what's stage number one? The world is a recipient to the downloading that we are downloading. We are downloading spiritual energies and spiritual powers, godly powers, and infusing it into a world that is ungodly. But that's not the objective. The objective is stage number two. What's stage number two? That just like the lamp, where it requires, in order for it to burn, it requires a wick, a flame from the outside, a fire, a flame to come from outside the lamp and to give it its light. But then the objective is that even when you move the lamp away, now it's burning of itself from within itself. The lamp itself creates its own fuel to burn. It's self-sustainable. So that's the way God has it with us as well. That the holiness that we project into the world should not be only during the duration of the mitzvah, while we're pumping, while we're downloading, but even when we step away from it, even when we leave, even when the Jewish people leave a certain country, city, place, even when an individual person leaves a certain physical place in which he's been visiting, doing godly things, he leaves that place should be lit for all of eternity, and it should burn from within itself. Now, where do we see that technically happens that way? So he says we see that phenomenally in actually where do we have a situation where we find that a person can draw holiness and sanctify an object. So here's an example. You can take leather, and you take the leather and you fashion them into black boxes. We take then another piece of a hide of an animal. Now, a hide of an animal is part of the material physical world that is not holy. Not only is it not holy, it was once of those types of stuff that cannot express anything godly. It's created in a way that is totally cut off from anything holy and godly. And yet you take this animal hide, turn it into parchment, you inscribe on it, "Hear, O Israel, God is one, God is our God, God is the Lord, God is one," and with the rest of it, and you make it into a pair of tefillin. So now you made it holy. You made something that is not holy into holy. Now what happens after you finish writing it and you leave? Even though the holiness is coming from the scribe, who has a holy soul, with a holy consciousness, with a holy awareness, that means the spirituality, that's the godly light that's infusing these boxes, is coming from, and that's its only source, from the scribe who rode up this pair of tefillin, but now the scribe can take a flight and go across the world. The scribe can even live off another 50, 60, 70, 80, 100 years, whatever, as long as he's going to live. And then, time comes and he leaves this world. He's not even in existence anymore, but the pair of tefillin remains a holy pair of tefillin forever. So that means it's self-contained. It doesn't need any more the influencer to make it holy. It is holy. Now let's take that even a step further. A person goes and he sanctifies an animal to become a sacrifice. That's something that we don't do today, but it's part of the mitzvot of the Torah. So in which we can take an animal, take a cow, take a sheep, and you say, this shall be holy and sanctioned to the temple. And now what happens is this animal is no more a normal animal like all the other millions of sheep that are in the world. This is a different type of an animal. It is holy. There is a godly, if we would have the right eyes, we would see a godly sparkle that is sparkling out of this animal because we've infused it with, then eventually we'll take this animal, we'll bring it to the temple, but we've changed the nature of the physicality of this animal. Fine. Now what happens is like this. A person wants to make a I said about an animal. Let's go back to the tefillin. Let's go back to the tefillin. It's possible by an animal. Let's go back to the tefillin. So we fashioned over here boxes and we made it holy. These boxes become a pair of tefillin. Fine. Not only does the tefillin continue to be holy even when we remove our hands from it, but more even, the tefillin can actually bring holiness to us. Simply, when a person puts on the tefillin, the sofer himself, the scribe himself, who fashioned this pair of tefillin, needs to wear tefillin every day. Now, we know that as a human being, you carry a holy soul, you're holy. Can you go to the bathroom? Yes. A human being goes to the bathroom. He can be the holiest person. He still has to go to the bathroom. But if he's wearing his tefillin, can he go to the restroom? Tefillin, you can't take into the bathroom. Why? Because it's holy. That means that the tefillin is now holier than the person who made it. Also, while you're wearing tefillin, for example, a human being, is he allowed to go to sleep? Yeah, of course you have to sleep. Are you allowed to go to sleep when you're wearing tefillin? No. Tefillin cannot be on a sleeping person. It's too holy. So what do we see from here? The tefillin is actually adding more holiness to the person than the person who made the tefillin. And here's another one. If a person wants to make an oath. Let's say a person is obligated to make an oath in court. Sometimes when two people come and they're two litigants and they're arguing about something, and one person makes a claim, and we don't know if we believe them. So certain times the court has the right to administer an oath on this individual. That the person is swearing that that he or she is saying is true. So just like it is in an American court, they hold up a Bible and you put your hands on it and you swear by the Bible. Same was in the courts. You would have to hold on either to a Torah scroll to take an oath, or you would have to hold on to a pair of tefillin. And you would swear by God's name, by the holiness of this object. Which means that the person's connection to God, the person's certainty of the validity of their truth is now being derived and coming from an object that needed the human being to make it holy. So what you're really getting over here is that even though the fire, like the lamp, even though this lamp was once dark, and the source of the light of the lamp is the person bringing light, bringing up an existing fire to the lamp. But then it could be that the person's fire goes out, and your only lamp that you have now that's illuminating to the person is the very lamp that you yourself lit. You gave it its fire, and now it's giving you its light. So that's how holy we can make physical things, that in the end they become the holiness, suddenly trigger something within inside of them and that it brings out their intrinsic holiness, and then they become the contributors to holiness to us. And on the bigger sense, that means that the physical world becomes the source of holiness for the spiritual worlds. The physical, which was once the student, becomes the teacher. Everything is flipped over. The physical informs, like it says when the Mashiach will come eventually, that the soul will be informed by the body. Now the body is informed by the soul. Then it's going to be the soul is going to be informed by the body. And that's how holy. And so now, before we were talking about our own bodies, and we're talking about a Jewish body, it's a different story. Here we're talking about the physicality of the outside world, the materials of all of the world. It can reach such a point that it exceeds the holiness of the ones that are making him holy in the first place. And that's God's objective when he gave us a world to make it holy. That not only should we imprint this world with holiness, not only should we coat the world with holiness, but we should extract, we should open up the world so deeply, and the holiness should catch on so deeply that it's burning of itself from within itself. Now, the Rebbe questions this in footnote 69, beautiful footnote, where the Rebbe says that this seems logically impossible. If we're saying that we're dealing with a certain material object entity that is void of any holiness, and its entire holiness is being delivered to it from a certain source, so we would understand. If this is a phone, okay? This phone is essentially a piece of matter that's lifeless. In order for it to operate, it needs energy. Where does it get energy? It has a battery. I have to charge the battery. So I charge the battery. Where's that charging coming from? From the electricity that's coming into it. So at a certain point, right? And then how long does it hold? As long as the charge holds. Then it uses up its energy. Then I have to recharge it again to get new energy, or else it can sit dormant and non-working for months and years, because it's not the source of its own power. This is not a power source. This is a recipient of power. So the power in this must be given to it. How in the world are we saying that now it generates? Now, we do see in a car, here we have a little example, that we do see with a car battery, that the car battery charges itself. That's why if you have ever a situation where your battery goes kaput, the battery isn't working, and you get a jump, you use cables and you give it a jump. What is the cable person, the guy who's coming to give you a jump, or if you do it yourself, what do you have to do? You have to keep your car running for half an hour, drive it, whatever, so that the battery has time to recharge itself. So we see such a phenomenon. But we need to understand, how does that really work? How can something that is a recipient of holiness from elsewhere then, first of all, go on its own? Secondly, not only that, it could contribute to its bestower. It can be a source of inspiration to the one who influenced it. I mean, I was talking about this on Wednesday last week. I gave a class called the Mind Expansion, Man versus Machine. We're seeing a situation like that a little bit, where we've imbued intelligence into machines. And now those machines are actually going ahead of us in intelligence, and they will outsmart the very humans who created them. So we see such a thing, that the student is rising beyond the teacher. But spiritually, how does that really work? What's the deeper meaning of why that is that way? So the Rebbe gives two possibilities of why it is that way. The Rebbe says possibility number one in footnote 69, a very, very core essential footnote. The Rebbe says possibility number one is as follows. This that we say, that physicality is void of godliness. It doesn't have godliness. And we need to bring godliness into the lowly physical world. That's only externally. Externally, on an experiential level, the physical doesn't have godliness. And it needs to receive it from a higher, from a mentor, from a teacher, from a spiritual source. So we have our spiritual souls coming into bodies, and that's how we begin this process of informing physicality of any kind of spirit, of holiness and of Hashem, of godliness. It says, but that's only a superficial look at the physical. Much deeper than that is that as we mentioned earlier, when we dig deeper, we find out that the physical, that we always thought that the physical doesn't have an intrinsic godliness to it, is not true. Physicality is also, and the godliness of this of the physical is not its soul. See, we always knew that within every physical object also has a soul, which means it also has spiritual energy, just not as visible. The soul of a human is very visible. The soul of an animal is less, to a lesser degree, but it's also a soul. The soul of a plant is pretty visible as well. You can see its growth. The soul of a stone is not visible. So the Kabbalists have to come and teach you that it also has a soul. And as we know, as we discussed, that energy is really, matter is really energy. That's a soul. But that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about over here is the matter of the matter, not the energy of the matter, not the soul that's within the physical. The physical, as physical, is physical. The coarseness of the physical, the trait that the physical is physical, that itself, that too is godly. That's another side of God. Another side of the divine truth is God's essence, and that is being portrayed, and that's the oomph, that's the thickness and the density, if you might call, of the physical. That it's so dense in itself is because it's touching on that essence where God is to himself. Wow. So then the coarseness of the physical is not a non-godly, that itself is its godliness, just to be redefined. So that's the reason why physicality eventually can stand on its own in its connection to God. Its connection to God doesn't require, in the beginning, until we've unlocked this deep secret in the physical. True, then physical is dense and thick, and it needs kind of enlightenment and inspiration. For that, it has to bend and yield to the soul. But that kind of holiness will always be dependent on when my soul teacher is close by, I'll be inspired. Teacher goes out of town, and I'm back to who I was. But that's not the Rebbe. That's the depth of what the Rebbe is teaching over here. The Rebbe says that's superficial. It's needed. In the beginning, it's needed. But then a much deeper truth arises. And what is that? That the physical has its own connection to God, a whole different avenue that the spirituals don't even have, that the physical has. Once you unlock that, then the physical can stand on its own light. Now, it can't be unlocked unless the physical is first the recipient of spiritual energies. It's only then that it kind of can unleash and open itself up to who it really is. That's the secret over here. But that's his first explanation. And then he gives a second explanation. And he says, now let's perhaps say that in the second explanation, the continuous spiritual illumination, or the continuous divine, the holiness that will continue in the physical. What does that mean? Its relationship with the divine, with God, will continue in the physical even after its spiritual mentor left it, which goes against the law of something, that if it doesn't have it and it's only receiving it from its source, it can only have it as long as the source is there giving it to it. Once the water dries up, it dries up. It doesn't have it on its own. But now the Rebbe says, but maybe not. Even though logically that makes sense, because we're dealing with divine, we're dealing with God, God is not bound to logic. And because God is not bound to logic, he can create an impossibility. What's the impossibility? The impossibility is that he can imbue something with a power that thing doesn't have, and it requires to receive it from a source, and yet it could continue to have it even after the source goes away. And even though you say that makes no sense, that can't be, and the answer is God doesn't have to make any sense. So he can make something that doesn't make any sense. And the The Rebbe brings an example to this. Interesting example. We are taught in Hasidic teachings that God continuously creates the world every second. That creation was not a one-time event, but that God is continuously sustaining and creating the world every second. And we have a verse that proves that. There's a verse that says, God, forever, O God, your words are in the heaven. So the Baal Shem Tov explains that means that God is continuously speaking the heavens into existence. But then there is a logic that is applied to it. Since everything that exists once didn't exist, which means exist, creation, anything that is really not. On its own, it's not. Before God messes with it, it's not. When God gets involved, when God's will, that's when it comes into being. So the moment God pulls out of it, since God is responsible for its beingness, the moment God says goodbye and God pulls out of it, that it is what it was without God getting involved. What was it without getting involved, without God getting involved? It was not. So really, what we're really saying is that everything is really not. Everything is because the true is the himself into it. But when the is himself back out, or retracts his is from everything, everything goes back to what it is. What it is without the is, it goes back to is not. Okay, that's the idea. That's logic. It makes sense. Fine. So the Rebbe teaches in many places that logic is faulty. Why is it faulty? Because it's true that it's based on logic. If what's responsible for existence is the source of is some kind of is outside of the thing, and therefore we would require that's a logic. But does that a logic apply to God? Hypothetically, here's the question: can God create something out of nothing? Absolute nothing. There's nothing here. Create something totally out of nothing, which means it's his power being imbued in it that's bringing it into existence. But can hypothetically God bring that into existence and then God saying, goodbye, I am pulling out, but I want you to continue existing even without me? Can that happen? Would hypothetically God be able to say goodbye, ciao, to the creation, but have the creation continue to exist? And you would say, well, it's impossible. God, you leave, we fall apart. And God would say, yeah, but I want you to be. And you'd say, but it's impossible. God says, I can do the impossible. I can make you be, even though your entire being is coming from me, and I'm pulling out, and yet I can make you be. So the Rebbe says, yeah, God could do that. But hold it. Would that mean that God is not within the world continuously? If God can create a creation without needing him anymore, does that mean that the creation really is void of God today because God pulled out? And the answer is no. Why is it no? Because we have a verse, we have proof statements in the Torah which state that God is continuously invested in creation. In other words, we don't imply logic here. Logic is not going to work because God creates logic. The very logic itself, God creates. God is not bound by any logic. So therefore, he's not, if he wants, he can do even what is completely irrational and illogical. And in that sense, so the Rebbe says, how do we really know that God is continuously, God's energy is everywhere and in everything all the time? Not because logic did say so, but because God revealed to us in the Torah that that's the way he created the world, in a way where the world will forever require him to be involved. And if he pulls out of it, it can't exist. But if it would not have stated in the Torah that that's the way it is, we could not just base it on logic that is telling us that that's the way it is, because logic is true about everybody else who is confined to logic, but not to God who is above and beyond logic. So the Rebbe says, Watch this. That God bound himself to that logic and created the world in a logical fashion where the creation cannot exist without him making it and continuing to sustain it, that rule that God is binding himself to the logic of it is only in creation. But it could be when it comes to mitzvahs, which in mitzvahs is a whole different project. It's not the project of creating the world. It's the project of making, of imbuing, making something holy and godly, which means giving something a relationship with God, an open relationship with God. Which we said earlier, the world was created in a way that it does not have a relationship with God. Now again, when I say relationship, of course God is creating it and sustaining it, but an open, conscious relationship with God. The physical world is created in a way that it purposely does not know and is not conscious of God. Now, in order to make it conscious of God, we have to imbue spirituality. That's what our soul does, and that's what mitzvahs does. So logic would say that what? That as long that the source has to constantly be imbuing this into it, that the spiritual has to always be there in order for this to be. So the Rebbe says, but okay, that's logic. God is not bound by logic. And therefore, the way it works is once we do a mitzvah with something, yes, we trigger it, we connect something to God through a mitzvah, but then once we did a mitzvah with something, now something that is not logical takes over. And that is that the object which was once godless is now self-generating its connection to God without any assistance from the outside. And even though it doesn't make any logic, it could do so. So according to the Rebbe's first explanation, the reason why it could continue this way is because essentially the physical is really godly. It's just that we have to unplug this truth. In the second interpretation, he might be arguing, no, it's one of the impossibilities that exist. That even though usually something that doesn't have a certain quality and receives that quality or that from something else would always be dependent on its source in order to give it that. That's logic. But over here, God is not running based on logic. In mitzvahs, God is not running based on logic. And he's doing something utterly illogical. He asks us just to start the process of connecting things to God, and then God implies a super powerful, a super rational phenomenon, in that things can maintain and a connection even though their source is gone. A connection to God. In this case, the source is the human, the source is the soul, the source is the spiritual side of things. Even if that parts, the physical could continue being godly and holy without a source. Without a source of that enlightenment and inspiration, or whatever you'll call it. That's cool. That's the second explanation. So now we go to chapter number 8. And but by the way, the Rebbe concludes, he says that, so this idea that something can sustain it is literally like a lamp. In a lamp, you light the lamp, and the lighting of the lamp comes from the person, but afterwards, the lamp generates its own light from within itself. Now, regarding, and this continues, it's very, very special. He says it's not only when it comes to mitzvot, to Torah and to mitzvahs, both that we do with ourselves and that we do with the world, we do outside of us, but even all of our conduct. Again, the ultimate objective is that we should be connected to God 24/7. And that everything that we are doing is coming from a godly place. Coming from a place of connection to the ultimate truth. Shouldn't be living as a tiny little speck of nothingness, caught up in our own nothingness, like ridiculous. But that every second of our existence, we are connected to the infinite, absolute being of beingness. And how is that possible? So there's a statement that says all your actions, even when you're not doing a mitzvah, should be for the sake of Him. That means that people call that mindfulness, but a higher mindfulness. Everything we do, when you're eating, be mindful. When you're drinking, be mindful. When you're sleeping, be mindful. When you're shopping, be mindful. When exercising, be mindful. Never allow God to, the ultimate truth of reality, to escape your existence. What are you mindful of? You're mindful of is, so there's few stages. The Rebbe says first stage is that whatever you do, you should think about it. How is this going to enhance my existence so that I can later do God's thing? So although right now I'm not doing God's, I'm doing my thing. I'm hungry now. I need to eat lunch. I'm doing I'm eating lunch so that I will be satisfied. I'll have a mind. I'll be able to think about my Creator. I'll be able to do a mitzvah. So that means that my lunch that I'm eating is now in support of a mitzvah. That's one level. But then there's no godly connection in the lunch itself, only that it will lead to something later. But then there's a deeper level. King Solomon says in Proverbs, Shlomo Melech says, in all your ways you should know him. All your ways, you're doing your stuff, but know him. How does that work? That works that when a person go back to lunch, you're eating lunch. So you're even though it's a very physical act, and it's in a sense an act that animals do as well. They also eat lunch. They don't have lunch, breakfast, dinner, there, whatever they have, but they're also eating. So a human being also eats, but a human being should eat with a higher consciousness. So much so that while you're eating the food itself should be communicating to you that there is a creator. Imagine eating the food, and when you feel the sensations of the food, first of all, even before you begin the pleasure of the food, just the fact that you feel nourished. So you're thinking that who's really nourishing me? God is nourishing me. God created the earth with this immense, crazy power that it can produce wheat. And that wheat can produce kernels. And the kernels could be ground and turned into this white flour powder, which if you mix it with water, that too God created, H2O from absolute. What a phenomenal idea that was. It turns into a rubbery material, like a dough, we call it dough. And then you roll it out and you add whatever here and there, a little salt, a little this, a little that. And you put it into a hot, which heat God also created, and a fire, and put it in a, take it out. And it's this delicious, nurturing, great piece of bread that now when I'm eating it, I'm being sustained. And I'm suddenly feeling how, God, you're nurturing my soul. You just gave me lunch. And if that lunch is not just a piece of bread, but it's got a little cheese to it, and it's got a little, I don't know what, other spread or other thing to it, and on the side you have a little salad, and you look at all the colors of it. Who ever thought of something so beautiful to make red tomatoes and a different type of red radishes with a white inside, and then peppers, and then whatever, I don't know, whatever else you have in a salad, all kinds of vegetables. And I said, this is incredible. And each one is delivering different nutrients and feeding different parts of your body. And you're realizing God is sustaining me. And suddenly in middle eating, you become so excited that you want to say hallelujah. You want to say hallelujah. You want to sit and praise God. And that's your entire experience of the food. You become so enthralled by the awesomeness of your creator while you ate lunch. Now, obviously, I will have to admit that that's not usually my experience while I eat lunch. But that should be and could be our experiences. We wouldn't be living in such a blocked state that that's the truth. Who really created all that? Who really brought that to me and to my table and enabled me to be able to eat that phenomenal lunch or breakfast or dinner? God. So when you realize that, so you're knowing it even in your ways. Fine. But the Rebbe says, as we say, we all know, that doesn't come naturally to us. Naturally, the physical things that we eat, the physical things that surround us, usually make us forget our purpose and our connection to God. They don't remind us. They trigger our egos. They trigger our lusts. and our own seeking of pleasure instead of our humility and surrender to God. No. What is physical and food, especially the more indulgent we have food and delights and stuff, it tends to inflate our sense of independence and not our sense of gratitude and surrender to a higher being. That's the nature. So we have to fight it. So it takes consciousness and fighting and overpower. The Rebbe says, however, that's not the objective. Its objective initially is to fight, but the ultimate objective, that we imbue the physical world around us with so much, and we train ourselves so deeply, that it starts to become a natural trigger, that everything physical in the world starts to become a natural trigger to inspire us towards holiness and God. That means that the godliness that's in the physical is coming from within the physical to us. We don't have to imbue it with something physical. It speaks to us immediately, shouts out to us something about God. Every time we meet something, it speaks to us about the Creator. It is communicating holiness to us. In other words, initially, we need to turn around physical things from their natural state of hiding and obscuring but the objective is that it shouldn't be that way. That everything in the world should act as triggers to trigger in us an awareness of God, of our Creator. So the Rebbe gives a little example of that. The Rebbe says that when it comes to little children, when we educate them, we're supposed to put a prayer book in their room. The Rebbe always encouraged that children should have their own prayer book, maybe their name inscribed on it. The Rebbe says that children should also have their own tzedakah box, charity box. And children should be taught that whenever they get money, sometimes children, they earn money, they have an allowance, so they get money, someone gives them Hanukkah gifts or this, whatever it is, they should take of their money every day and they should put it into charity. So you train children to do mitzvahs. The Rebbe says you're supposed to position the physical tzedakah box and the siddur inside a child's room, that as soon as the kid walks into this room, you don't have it somewhere in the back, somewhere in the front, it's hanging on the wall, that the first thing you see, it's so visible, and you decorate it with so many colors, and you make it so nice that it catches your attention. And the moment the little kid comes into the room, the first thing he sees is his tzedakah box is talking to him and saying, here, do a mitzvah with me. That's just how simply the Rebbe puts it. We need to set ourselves up that the physical things around us remind us about our purpose in life to do godly things. It's as if the Rebbe says, just like the lamp is going up to itself, the Rebbe says the siddur should be calling to the child, come take me, read in me. The Chumash, the Torah book, should be calling to the child and say, learn with me. And the charity box should be saying to the child in a song, here, place some tzedakah inside it. He says, if that's true about children, it should definitely be about adults. Our physical things that we have and around us, we train our eyes so deeply. And as a result, here's the thing, the higher our consciousness is, the more literally there is a refinement taking place in the physical or in the world around us. So the physicality around us actually becomes more refined by our mind shifts. So the shift is not only in our own mind, the shift is actually in the object. I'll give you a little story. You'll get what I'm saying with this little story. In other words, our thoughts and our observation of things affect the things. Sometimes to the point that other people can see things differently because we looked at it once. So here's a beautiful story that illustrates this. There was a great tzaddik, a great rabbi, a great Hasidic Rebbe, who was once traveling and he got caught in a storm and he needed to lodge somewhere. So he found the closest inn and there was a room available. The guy gave him the room. And the next morning, this Hasidic rabbi comes to the owner of the inn, was a Jewish person, and he said to him, "Tell me about the clock that's in the room." So he says, "No, there's a secret about that. Tell me about that clock." So he said, "Well, that clock once belonged to a very saintly man. What happened was, there was a saintly man. No, I mixed up a little bit. This Hasidic rabbi stayed in this room. He came there not because he was caught in a storm. He just came and he stayed in that room. The next morning, he asked the guy, tell me about what's with that clock." So he couldn't remember. Then he remembered. He remembered that he received it from another rabbi that once stayed there, who, for whatever reason, didn't have money to pay for his room. He had to be there for a while. They got ill or something. He had to be there for a while. And he told them, "Listen, I don't have anything, but I'm going to give you this clock that I inherited it from my father." Turns out that this clock once belonged to a very, very great tzaddik. His name was the Chayzer from Lublin, the seer of Lublin. So this person said, "How did you know that this clock was a special clock belonging to a great rabbi?" He says, "I'll tell you why. Usually when there's a clock, it makes me sad. A clock is not a happy object. Why? Because it reminds you that life is ticking away. And the thought that I always get, the feeling that I get when I hear a clock ticking, they used to have louder clicks. Back then, it's about 150 years ago, 200 years ago. He says the clock, it reminds, is kind of a little bit morbid, because every second I hear, another minute passed, and you're a moment closer to the grave. So that's not too of a happy. Says, for some reason, this clock in the room was, every time I heard it, it was bringing me such joy and such excitement. And what was I feeling? The clock was saying, it's a minute closer to Mashiach. It's a minute closer to the Mashiach. It's a minute closer to redemption. And I realized that someone had this clock in his room that was so excited about Mashiach coming that every minute that passed, he wasn't hearing the darkness of the grave, the dark future. He was hearing the bright future of the ultimate enlightenment of all of the world. What does that tell you? That a person owns a clock. The objects in a person's house, in a home, in a person's environment become affected and impacted by our thoughts, by our aspirations, by our feelings. So what the Rebbe is saying over here is, our influence in the world ultimately has to be so deep that we change the objects that are around us, that they become, instead of objects that naturally follow the naturally physical rule, which physicality usually makes us forget God and holiness, our objects should become so connected that they themselves inspire us to pray, inspire us to sing, inspire us to gratitude, inspire us to be aware of God in a deeper way than ever before. That's the meaning that the flame shoots up on itself. Based on all of this, we're going to understand, if this is the theme of Parshat Beha'aloscha, based on this, we're going to understand the meaning of why it is precisely in this portion where we encounter the three books we discussed in the first class, and how can it be that the sixth book, starts with the words, the people were complainers, but that we're going to end now, and we are going to continue, Bezrat Hashem, in the next class, which is going to be either Saturday night or Sunday, Bezrat Hashem. So stay tuned to the concluding class. We're holding by chapter 9.